Carlo, you're an academic and you write scholarly works, but what attracts you to more journalistic nonfiction? Where did that impetus come from?
Oh, that came from the beginning. I went and got a PhD and became a professor because it's a good day job for a writer of all kinds of things. And so my intention all along was to go get some training, and so I would have something to say. You know, I sat down to write many times in my 20s and nothing came out. And it was only after I went to graduate school and got some training and found a field that I was interested in that I found I had things to say. And then, you know, once you have some things to say, then it's a question of, well, which form am I going to use to say them? And sometimes the scholarly essay is the right form, sometimes the journal article is the right form, but sometimes the profile is the right form, or the personal essay, or all the possibilities for writing analytically about culture.
It's clear what some of your interests are: blues, boxing, writing, urban landscapes, neighborhoods. But are there any specific criteria or qualities that tend to attract you to a subject?
Well, sometimes I'm surprised. I've come to appreciate a good assignment, so I have editors who I trust who send me on good assignments. The title of the book, Playing in Time, comes from a piece that an editor thought of. He said, you know, would you like to go to jazz fantasy camp for a week, which is not something that had been on my research agenda. But he knew me well, and he knew the kinds of things that appealed to me. And one of the things that really appealed to me about that story, and that you see in a lot of the pieces in this book, is it's a story about somebody who's good at something and how they got to be that way. And it's usually the case that somebody has some kind of inchoate impulse inside of them, you know, an appetite for hitting or a desire to make noise or something, to make beauty. And it's the story of how that person found containers into which to pour that impulse. And those containers could be institutions, they could be genres or styles, they could be, you know, keeping a certain kind of company. And often that's the real attraction of the piece, someone who's good at something and the world through which they move to become good at that thing.
A dominant theme in these stories is creativity. Not really the creativity of Michelangelo, but that of the more ordinary person who still manages to attain success despite constraints. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I've come to appreciate the constraint part more and more. I think that is often what I'm really interested in, is not simply how did this person get good at this thing, but what were the possibilities that were foreclosed and that were open to this person. There's a profile of a boxer, a heavyweight boxer in this book, Shannon Briggs, who found himself in the position of being kind of the last top-flight African-American heavyweight in the world, facing this, as he saw it, mob of Russians coming to get him, because he had asthma as a kid, so he couldn't play football, which is what all the other American heavyweights are doing, is playing linebacker, basically. And because he had asthma, he couldn't play football, and so he found his way to this much more esoteric and archaic skill. You know, and that's really, as you say, a story as much about constraint as it is about possibility.
In your foreword, you describe yourself as a child of the middle class who finds himself attracted to both the street and the library, and who fashions a life out of exploring the relationship between them. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, you know, I think that, first of all, I think it's a type. There's a lot of people like that in one form or another, and as I point out in the introduction of the book, some of the writers who I regard as touchstones or models really show that same set of impulses, I think. So for instance, A.J. Liebling, the New Yorker writer of the 50s, Émile Zola, the French novelist. And what appealed to me about reading those people is that they had these two different, you know, you could call them skill sets or ways of knowing, right? I think the model in a lot of ways is Ishmael in Moby Dick, right? Ishmael spent a lot of time working on a whale ship, getting really good on the shop floor, and he spent a lot of time clearly reading. And he's proud, in fact, overly proud of what he's read, and he makes a big point of, you know, mentioning every book he's ever read. And those characters are attractive to me because they find a way to bridge those multiple ways of knowing. And almost always, the thing that attracts me to the writing of, say, Liebling is that unless you have both kinds of knowing at your disposal, you can't really get at your subject. In his case, his subject was boxing. And I think, you know, there's a lot of subjects like that. I think blues is like that. I think the study of cities is like that. You need to be a reporter. You need to go out and find out what people are up to. You need to go out there and, you know, bodily and figure out what's going on. And you need to get into the archives, and you need to get into the library and find out what the history is of what you're looking at, or else you can't really see it. And I think in a lot of cases, those are the kind of subjects that attract me. Those are the kind, when you watch a boxing match, you could just watch the boxing match itself. You could just watch the fighters fighting and do a kind of close reading of that. But unless you understand how the money is flowing behind the scenes of that fight, you might completely misread what you're seeing. You might see, this kind of the triumph of the human spirit, when in fact what you're looking at is a mismatch, which is dictated by the money. And so it's that need to deploy multiple kinds of knowing that I think that's the appeal of, going to the street and going to the library in order to sort of surround your subject matter. And in my case, where I grew up, you had to get to the library by sort of running the gauntlet down this street where the tough kids in the neighborhood hung out. So there was this, kind of high degree of difficulty in actually getting to the public library, the branch of the public library in my neighborhood.
When did you first develop an interest in boxing?
Like a lot of kids who grew up in the 70s, boxing was on, the archaic concept of free TV in the 70s. It was on Wide World of Sports. And in fact, Larry Holmes, the guy I ended up meeting when I got interested in boxing as an adult, was on TV. He was fighting for the title and defending the title when I was a kid. And I didn't have any particular interest in it, but it was there and I was interested in it. And then I went off and got a PhD, and my first job was at Lafayette College, which is in Easton, Pennsylvania, which happens to be where Larry Holmes lives. And what I got interested in was the gym, not so much the fights, but the gym. The gym is a place of teaching and learning, and there's not an infinite number of things to do in Easton, Pennsylvania. And one of the things there was to do was to hang out in Larry Holmes' gym. He was in his 40s. He's still fighting. He fought for the world title when I was there. And, I was attracted to the gym because it was this place of teaching and learning, and there was all these different kinds of knowingness there. And you could really do those two things that we were just talking about. You could just go and hang out, because a lot of the knowledge of the fight world is oral, and you need to just hang out and listen to people talk. And then you could go in the library and be reading A.J. Liebling and Pierce Egan and, all the way back to book 23 of the Iliad. There's a long boxing literature that you can be catching up on. And that's exactly the kind of problem that appeals to me. There's some street application and there's some library application.
Heavyweight boxing today seems to be in somewhat of disarray. What do you think is the future of the big championship fights? What's the future of boxing itself?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, like a lot of things that I'm interested in, it had its golden age in the past. I think that's true of blues too. And boxing had its moment when it was the most, boxing and baseball were the most important sports in America, and before World War II. Horse racing was probably third, actually. And then the school sports, the ball sports, kind of overtook them, and overtook boxing especially. It has some kind of future. It's clearly an esoteric TV spectacle and not part of neighborhood life in the way it was. But if we were having this conversation in Spanish, for instance, I think we would regard boxing as a bigger part of life. Or if we were having this conversation in Germany, right, or in parts of the former Soviet Union. And I think that the other thing that's going to happen sooner or later is that China will become the next big boxing country. They have all the pieces of the traditional puzzle that produces a fight culture. For business reasons, a lot of boxing business people have tried to do business in China and failed. But it's coming sooner or later. And now they even have Macau. They have the biggest gambling center in the world, really, and which is the last missing piece. That they already have the millions of displaced industrial workers living in cities looking for something to do, which you need, and they already have a kind of martial arts culture and a deep interest in getting good at boxing to win Olympic medals. Right? They've made offers to several trainers I've interviewed. So that'll come next, and then. People in some countries will be talking about decline of boxing. Maybe in Germany they'll start talking about the decline of boxing, but in China it'll be on the rise. It'll never be what it was, but I think that it'll sort of persist as a niche sport. I don't know about forever, but certainly longer than I will.
Carlo, you're clearly a bluesman. Not surprising, seeing that you come from Chicago. Yet you write a fascinating story about polka in Chicago and Indiana, even punk polka. Can you say something about that?
That's a good example of having an editor I trust and who trusts me. That's the same guy who sent me to Jazz Fantasy Camp, David Rowell, at the Washington Post magazine. He, they do a travel issue, and I said, well, I'd like to do a travel story where I go to where I'm from, Chicago, and I don't do the thing that everybody does, which is go and see blues. That's sort of the path of least resistance for a tourist in Chicago, and I in particular, Chicago blues these days is really, really dominated by the guitar and the guitar solo. So I thought and said, well, what will take me into the parts of Chicago that I haven't spent much time in, and what will take me away from the guitar? So let's try polka and the accordion, right? And the irony of that story is that I ended up my Virgil, the guy who led me around Chicago, was the premier and only punk polka guitar player in Chicago. This guy Don Hedeker, who a very smart and funny guy. By the way, another one of these people deeply attracted to both the street and the library, knows everything about the history of polka, and spends a lot of time going through neighborhoods where that used to be Eastern European and are now no longer, going through the thrift shops buying old polka records, because when the older people die, that's where their record collections end up. And so, I mean, that was really a story about getting to know the place you're from in a different way, and really getting to understand your city in a different way. Chicago, I grew up in Chicago I really understood it as a black and white city. And that polka story is really about Chicago as a Mexican and Polish city. And it is a great Mexican and Polish city. At one point, it was the second Polish city in the world after Warsaw. And to really see the rest of the city, and to really let the curiosity about the story take you into the rest of the city. And I ended up going all over the city to neighborhoods I'd never been to that were sort of legendary to me growing up, looking for these other musics, these other hometown musics that I had never really encountered.
Your affinity for the marginalized, the underdog, shines through. Can you say something about why you're particularly attracted to such people?
I guess I would sort of flip it around and say that the kind of person who's riding high and gets all the attention is often not particularly interesting to me. I've never found Mike Tyson interesting, although he's got plenty of weaknesses, right? I never found Mike Tyson interesting, and even though it's sacrilege, I never found Muhammad Ali that interesting, to tell you the truth. Whereas I found, Larry Holmes, for instance, who was champion after Ali, very interesting, in part because Larry Holmes was very much a craftsman, and Ali was very much a celebrity. I'm not that interested in celebrity. So I don't know if it's so much the marginalized as it is, I like journeymen and women. I like people who are, orthodox practitioners of a craft. And so I think a fighter who's 16-16 is often much more interesting than a fighter who's 32-0 and has been sort of protected and coddled through his whole career. And I think that it's often the case that by looking at the kind of mid-level practitioners and the mid-level practice of whatever it is you're looking at, you can see things about the practice as a whole that you would miss if you were just doing it at the top. And as a reporter, when you're examining the top, you're also really constrained much more by the rules of big-time reporting. So that's, you'll see these magazine stories that are like, I spent an hour in a hotel room talking to a famous Hollywood actor, and here's my profile, right? Whereas I can say, well, I spent a month following this person around because no one else has ever been interested in him, so he had no problem with me following him around. And I found out something about how you get to be pretty good at this. And I think in a lot of ways that what you're interested in is characters living the consequences of a bigger history. The journeymen and the mid-level practitioners live those consequences in richer and more interesting ways. And sometimes also that the celebrities are just bizarrely unique individuals who aren't that indicative of whatever that larger thing is that you're looking for.
You're of course interested and write about cities and urban landscapes. You're from Chicago, you now live in Boston, or more specifically Brookline. There's differences between these two big cities. Can you talk about some of the differences?
Well, I tried to address some of this in the book. I wrote some more personal essays about that. There's a piece about Boston in the book called Ghosts, and that was the State Department was putting together a book of pieces, American writers writing about cities, and they got in touch with me, and I thought, great, they're going to ask me to write about Chicago, And they said, well, you can't write about Chicago because we asked Stuart Dybek, who's one of my favorite writers, and I can't argue with that choice. If I was putting together the book, I'd pick Stuart Dybek too. But they said, well, you can write about Boston, and at first my reaction was, a booby prize. It's not Chicago. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, this is actually the piece I'm equipped to write. I could write about Chicago in 1978, but it's harder to it's harder to write about Chicago now. I'm really out of touch with it in a lot of ways, and so being forced to write about Boston or accepting the assignment made me think about exactly that question: what makes it the way it is? And the thing that really struck me, the thing that I tried to capture in the piece, is how I think of Boston as almost like one of those Zen gardens, you know, with a little tiny bridge over a little tiny pond, and you know, and it is for me a much more contemplative city. It's on a much smaller scale, and it's denser, so that it's much more layered and denser than Chicago. So you really spend a lot more time. You know, I've walked down this block hundreds of times in my life, and this time I'm going to stop and look at this one doorway, and you know, and that's kind of a much more Boston moment. Whereas when I think of Chicago, I think of it on this gigantic scale, this kind of cyclopean scale, where you know and I think of it now as so young compared to Boston. You know, all the great ruins of my childhood rose and fell, you know, in my lifetime, pretty much. You know, the steel mills, which are like, for me, the ruined cathedrals of Chicago, you know, they fell in the 70s, in the 80s. I was around for that, right? Whereas there's many more layers of Boston history to unpeel. And that's not only attractive, but that's kind of become normal for me. You know, I lived in Chicago for 18 years, and I'm a lot older than 36. So I've really lived on the East Coast longer than I ever lived in Chicago.
All your books, I believe, are available through Kindle. Do you embrace that technology?
I don't use it, but then again, I don't use a lot of technologies. I don't, besides the fact that I like the tactile experience of a book, and this book is what I have instead of a website, right? It's a sort of a selection of work, some new work, but much of it published elsewhere. The one reading technology that I do use all the time is audiobooks, because you can listen to a book while you run, and I like to run, and especially at night, and that's a perfect marriage of technology and intention, that I do a lot of my leisure reading while listening, and it really does change your experience of the book, and there are times when I'll listen to it and then go back and read it, because you know, it was powerful enough that I wanted to get those two angles on it. But as a general rule, I don't, you know, I try to stay away from screens. I try to avoid reading on the screen. I'm agnostic about what other people want to do, but at least in my household, we tend to read things in print.
A number of important newspapers, US newspapers, are now defunct. Some newspapers have gone online only. What do you think is the future of newspapers?
Now, here's a subject that I'm uniquely unequipped to pronounce upon, so I will not. I don't know what the future of it is. I do, whatever form it takes, it's pretty clear to me that there's whole realms of human experience, like people running businesses and people running governments, who cannot get by on blogs because they actually need the stuff they read to have some, you know, reasonable shot at being true. Whatever form that is that it comes to, them in, on paper or not, I have no idea. For me, I'm one of those people where I get up in the morning and I go downstairs and I open the door and there's a physical newspaper there, and I take it out and I read it. And I guess I would imagine that the technology is also going to make that easier too. So if we reach a stage where you download a book and then print it on your personal book printer, doesn't make much difference to me. If the technology allows me to then bind and print my own books as if it was the 16th century, fine. You know, that'll work. I just, you know, what's happening with newspapers and what's happening with magazines, they're very much in a panic about it, and I understand that. But they need good work, and I'm interested in giving them good work. So from my point of view, you know, I still get paid to write stuff that gets printed on paper. And then, by the way, they slap it on the website for free. But at least in the business I'm in, you get paid to write stuff that gets printed on paper.
Has an editor ever asked you to do anything strange or odd to get a story? Or indeed, what's the craziest thing you've ever done while writing a story?
Not too much, actually. I tend not to take crazy stories. In fact, it's often the case that I'm trying to convince an editor that something that seems, you know, often the things I want to do don't reduce to one-sentence pitches that would make the editors get all excited, you know. And so, like, well, let me just hang around with these people, and and I'll write a good story about them. I tend not to do particularly crazy things as a reporter, and part of that is because if I have a kind of a marketable skill as a reporter, it's basically to just disappear in plain sight and hang around people and have them forget I'm there and just talk as they would talk. And that happens in the locker rooms of boxers. One of the things I like to do that fight writers tend not to do is I like to hang around in a fighter's locker room in the hours before a fight. And they're very tense, and people tend to say revealing things about themselves. And the whole secret of that is just sort of pull in your antenna and not really be present. And I've done the same thing, spending time in the office of the governor of Massachusetts. I did a profile of him, and it's just about disappearing, basically. So I'm much more interested in other people doing crazy things rather than me doing crazy things. And I like to be present when those crazy things happen. But as a general rule, I don't do any stunt journalism. About the stuntiest thing in this book is I was forced to polka with the proprietor of the Baby Doll Polka Lounge when I was doing the polka story, which was difficult and in some ways humiliating work, but it was necessary to get the story.
Carlo, is there anything else that you'd like to say in closing?
Thinking about it as a physical book, one of the deepest pleasures of this book for me is the work of the photographer Paul D'Amato, who did the photograph on the cover, which is just a street scene in Chicago in the neighborhood of Pilsen. And I love his work, and there's something about that picture and others of his that just reeks of Chicago, and it's hard to say exactly what it is. Something is with the water towers in the distance, or the shape of the row houses on the street, and part of the deep satisfaction of it being a book and not a website is exactly in things like that, in these photographs that evoke a place. And in my case, the more personal the essays get, the more they tend to find their way back to Chicago. And as the book goes on, sort of Chicago appears more because the essays sort of move more from the profile to the first person essay. And anyway, one of the satisfactions of it is exactly that kind of evocative quality that both a photograph and an essay can have to call up not just a place, but a place in time. And I find myself constantly being drawn back to Chicago in the 1970s, which is the formative moment for me, and which somehow that photograph manages to evoke, even though it's a picture taken in the last 10 years.